Here is my article critique of Chartrand and Bargues's 1999 paper, The Chameleon Effect, the Perception Behavior Link in Social Interaction. So, as a bit of a study background, there had been several studies focusing on the tendency for humans in particular to engage in mimicry behaviors in social situations. Chartrand and Bargue termed this the chameleon effect because it essentially allowed individuals to blend in with their social environment and not stand out. And not only was this tendency to mimic thought to be non conscious, as the authors described it, but also it wasn't exactly clear what the purpose of this mimicry type behavior was. Nevertheless, perception is still implicated, even though individuals don't seem to be aware that they're actually engaging in similar behaviors as their interaction partner. There nevertheless seems to be a need for individuals to perceive each other and the behaviors that they're engaging in order to actually mimic them, which makes sense. Despite the correlational research that had been done at the time that had led to this area of interest for these authors, none of these studies had utilized the experimental rigor necessary to allow inferences regarding causality or determining the direction of effects. And also, it was not clear exactly what the function of mimicry was, as I said before. It's not clear exactly what the benefit or the evolutionary purpose for these would be. So basically, Chartrand and Bargues's 1999 paper included 3 separate experiments. Each were testing a different set of hypotheses that sort of built on each other. So the results of experiment 1 led to the hypothesis for experiment 2. And then the results of experiment 1 and 2 sort of compounded to lead to experiment 3. So experiment 1 was probably the most rigorous of the 3, basically trying to establish, is mimicry real? And in the sense of statistics, that basically means, is a statistically significant effect demonstrable? Can that be observed? And does this effect occur amongst strangers, or is it actually dependent on other contextual factors? And then, does an individual's mimicry behavior change in response to the behaviors of someone else who basically is deliberately changing their social behaviors? Does the behavior of the participant follow the deliberate change in a confederate, basically? Experiment 2 was trying to assess what the social or the potential social benefit of mimicry would be. And then experiment 3 was looking at, okay, spoiler alert, the mimicry effect is real. And so what individual differences can explain variance in mimicry? Basically, do individuals differ in how much they engage in mimicry, and why? Why would that be the case? So in experiment 1, the sample consisted of 35 male and female undergraduates. There was no specific proportion reported, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, but that's a little suspect for me. It makes me think that it's probably heavily weighted in one direction, but it's impossible to know for sure. And I think that that's important, but I digress. The method basically consisted of having 2 Confederates who would pretend to be fellow participants, and individually, 1 Confederate at a time would join the actual participant, and basically they were told they're testing a new projective psychological measure, and so the focus was on looking at like a set of pictures and trying to just expand on whatever comes to mind based on those pictures. And the Confederate, each one was assigned a specific facial expression, which was basically either smiling or neutral, as well as a behavior which was either face rubbing or shaking their foot. And basically, the Confederates would switch on and off between these specific behaviors based on whatever the first Confederate did, the second Confederate would do the other behaviors. So if Confederate 1 smiled, Confederate 2 would have a neutral face, and then vice versa with the face rubbing and the foot tapping or shaking or whatever it was. And then these sessions were recorded, and trained judges would watch the recordings and code relevant behaviors and participant expressions. And the hypothesis was that whatever behaviors, whatever the behavioral manipulations the Confederates were exhibiting, that would correspond subsequently with similar behaviors exhibited by the participants, and that increase in relevant behaviors would be specific to whatever the Confederate was exhibiting last. So it wouldn't just be that Confederate 1 comes in and smiles and that the participant is smiling, and then Confederate 2 comes in and the participant is going to keep smiling even though the Confederate 2 was neutral faced. Rather, whatever behavior the participant is exhibiting, it's going to be dependent on whatever the Confederate is exhibiting. Those are basically the hypotheses. Hopefully I explained that well enough for it to be comprehensible. And the results, there were 2 judges who coded behaviors, and so inter-rater reliability was basically, I think it was split half reliability was used. Actually, I don't even think a specific reliability measure was reported, but that's a little bit nitpicky. But anyways, the reliability for the smiling behaviors, unsurprisingly, it seems like a pretty easy behavior to code, was 0.89. Foot shaking was 0.68, and then face rubbing was only 0.5, which to me that seems a little low for reliability, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. But basically, they used a repeated measures ANOVA to assess, does the frequency of smiling, face rubbing, and foot shaking vary significantly depending on what the Confederate behaviors were, whatever behaviors the Confederates were exhibiting. And indeed, the results supported those hypotheses. So there was more smiling, face rubbing, and foot shaking when the Confederates were exhibiting those specific behaviors. So there did appear to be some mimicry happening there, and that was demonstrated experimentally, which suggests that indeed the Confederates' behaviors likely caused the participants to engage in those similar behaviors as well. So this was allowing for causal inference. This was the first study that allowed that. Experiment 2 consisted of 72 male and female undergraduates. Once again, no specific numbers for each gender were reported, which I think is just, it's interesting. Maybe it was the style of the 1990s, who knows. But basically, for the method, there were 2 Confederate conditions. One where a Confederate would mimic the participant in whatever they're doing, and then the other Confederate would just be neutral, would not engage in any kind of mimicry at all. And basically, participants completed a questionnaire afterward, rating the degree to which they liked the Confederates, as well as how smooth they perceived the interactions to be. And for each one of these outcome measures, it consisted of 1 item each. And those 2 items for the 2 outcome measures were embedded in a 10-item inventory to kind of obscure the hypothesis. And the hypotheses were that the mimicking condition was going to lead to higher ratings of liking, and then same thing for perceived smoothness. So the results, a multivariate analysis of variance was used with liking and smoothness as the dependents, and sure enough, there was a significant effect of mimicking across both of those. As far as individual ANOVAs, the results were in the expected direction, where participants tended to give higher liking ratings for the Confederates who did engage in mimicry, as well as perceived smoothness. And they also tested to see, like, did Confederates, because the Confederates were not told what the study hypotheses were, but it was still possible that they engaged in irrelevant behaviors that could be confounding. So judges were tasked with rating irrelevant behaviors that they thought would be salient. So, for example, did the Confederates happen to smile more in some conditions, or did they act more friendly? And basically, the The judges just used Likert like scale items to rate the degree to which these kind of irrelevant behaviors occurred. And there was no significant difference between these conditions as far as the frequency of these sort of behaviors. So basically, they concluded that these potentially confounding behaviors likely did not affect the results. And so the results are likely still valid. So all of that is basically to say that mimicking was associated, at the very least, it was associated with higher rates of liking that individual as well as perceiving the interactions with that individual as being smooth. You could think of it maybe as like higher rapport. And then experiment 3 consisted of 50 undergraduate students, and the method was pretty much identical to experiment 1, except the Confederates did not do anything with their facial expressions. They just maintained neutral facial expressions. And then participants completed the perspective taking and empathic concern subscales from a already established measure, which is the IRI. And the hypothesis was that participants who had high perspective taking would subsequently have higher mimicry behaviors, and that empathic concern would have no effect. And indeed, the results did support that. Also, inter-rater reliability was very high for face rubbing and foot shaking. Essentially, participants who had high perspective taking rubbed their face and shook their foot more than low perspective taking participants. So they engaged in those mimicry behaviors much more. But there was no effect for empathic concern. So for some specific critiques, in experiment 1, I think it's interesting that the effect for foot shaking was p equals 0.06, and I think we all know what the typical alpha used for determining significance is, which is 0.05. In fact, usually it has to be less than 0.05, so I think it is interesting that the authors concluded that it was a significant effect, even though that p-value did not quite reach that threshold. So yeah, I don't really know what to think about that other than that just seems a little unscrupulous to me. Also, the inter-rater reliability for face rubbing was pretty low, honestly, and so it's hard to know to what degree that rater data for face rubbing, how reliable it was. It doesn't seem like it would actually be very reliable if the reliability was basically only 50% agreement. That seems very low to me, so I don't know, that could undermine the validity of the experiment 1 results, which is a pretty big deal. But that seemed to be kind of the implications of that seemed to be really kind of brushed over by the authors. For experiment 2, I thought it was really weak that each dependent measure was only based on one self-rating item. Like that just seems really inadequate to me from a psychometric perspective for an entire outcome variable to only be based on one item, one self-rating item. That, to me, that just doesn't seem like it covers content validity. And then there was no factor analysis, so they didn't. Obviously, you wouldn't do factor analysis if you only have one item. So basically, yeah, I think that they should have somehow incorporated more than one item for each outcome measure. I think that psychometrically, that's very suspect. And then I would say the same criticism for the Confederate irrelevant behavior rating measures, but I think that one was less glaring because those measures were not the literal outcome measures of interest. And then experiment 3, there was no reporting of gender characteristics at all. I'm also not quite sure why the authors decided to take participants' raw self-ratings and then just split them into one of two categories rather than assessing the raw data. It seems like there could be a lot of information lost in that decision, but no justification was provided for that. So I'm not really sure why they decided to do that other than maybe simplicity. I'm not sure, but I think it would have been good for them to talk about why they decided to do that. As a general critique, the participants always consisted of convenience samples. Confederates, also interesting, were always female, so it would have been nice to have both male and female Confederates just to really rule out the potential influence of gender on those various experiments. However, as an overall strength, I think the internal validity of experiment one establishing causality, I think there was sufficient evidence to suggest that the perception of the Confederate behavior led to an increased mimicry. I think you can confidently say that. And then because of that, the results of experiment three also make sense. The implications of this study are that subtle social behaviors occur without our awareness, and these sort of mimicry behaviors, specifically this chameleon effect, seems to serve the purpose of increasing rapport and social cohesion. But I think future research could really improve upon this study, as well as make the results more generalizable by replicating it with more diverse samples. And I think it would also be important to explore the effects of cultural differences on both mimicry and the effects of mimicry on how people perceive one another in terms of how they like each other and the smoothness of the interactions. Here is my reference, and thank you for watching.